All right, welcome to week 4 of interpersonal communication. So this week we'll be kind of doing the first of 3 weeks. We'll be kind of doing this interlude from um, the more thematically driven weeks, where we're talking about different, sorts of interpersonal relationships, and we're going to be reading these two philosophical books. The one we start this week, Alfonso Lingus, The Community of Those Who Have Nothing in Common. And then we'll finish that next week, and then the following week we'll read Roberto Esposito's Persons and Things. So I'll kind of, we'll do the normal thing. I'll talk about some things from these chapters. Before that, we'll talk about the podcasts. So I've gotten in the podcast from all of the groups. Um, I will try to have those graded within the next couple of days and send those back to you. Um, and the email attached with this video, I will be including the group that you should be responding to for your podcast response, which is due this Friday. So these are similar to the reading response reflections, but this is basically a way for you to engage with the discussions that your classmates are having, even in the groups that you're not assigned in. So I'll also include there's a description of this assignment in the syllabus. I think it's pretty straightforward. Basically, this is a constructive way of you basically saying, here are some ideas that they discuss. Here are some connections I saw. Here's how we can take it further. This isn't an opportunity for you to critique the ideas of your classmates, but for you to kind of explore some implications together. So, and those will be public. We'll have those on a discussion board. So there's a little bit of accountability there that don't write something that you wouldn't want the other group to see that you've written about them. So there's that. The other thing that I just need to say is so this is week 4. This is halfway through this 8-week session. There are a number of students who did not participate in the podcast and have missing assignments. If that's you need to email me right away so we can figure out how to get you back up to speed and get you involved for the next podcast. This is really important. I mean, basically I can't give you, especially in an asynchronous course, it's not even like I can give you credit for showing up unless you're doing the work. So please send me a message as soon as possible. So all of those logistical kind of things aside, we'll get into the Lingus book. And I'll preface it Okay, sorry for the choppiness there. I hit my forward slide button twice, and so I had to go back and delete. Anyway, PowerPoint. So before we talk about Lingus, I'm just going to kind of do a brief sort of overview of how to read philosophical texts. This is one way to read philosophical texts. Sort of everybody can have a different approach, but the idea behind sort of talking this way is that I recognize that this book and the next book are difficult books that are, if you're not a philosophy major or interested in philosophy or philosophy of communication, then this style of writing and way of thinking might kind of be very foreign to you. So the first thing that I'll say is that it is like reading a new language. And it's not just like reading a new language, it's like reading a new language that where you're engaging in a conversation between people you don't know. And what I mean by that is that nobody enters into reading philosophy basically ready to read philosophy. That this conversation is a conversation that's been ongoing since ancient times, and it is sort of specialized in the language that it uses in the sorry, I'm getting my cord so that my laptop doesn't die. It's specialized in the language that it uses. It's specialized in the ways that it talks about ideas. And so basically it's always hard to enter into. That you always enter into it, and it should kind of make your brain hurt a little bit. But that there is also a bit of a payoff, whereas you stick with it. Sometimes it takes until you get to the end of a book, and then you have that moment where it clicks and you say, oh, that's what this was all about. So that's the first thing that I'll say is just persevere, persevere. But in terms of strategies, um, thinking through what's the main argument, what's the secondary argument, what's the particular point. So what the book has a main argument, a goal that it's trying to come across or convey. Um, and everything else that's within that text should be addressing that main argument. But the main argument is made up of secondary arguments, which might be the chapters or the sections, right? Where these are supposed to prove or demonstrate more specific points. That's less than the general argument, but it's still arguing something. And then the sentences, right? The small claims that each thing that you're engaging with is making a particular point. And it helps to, at least for me, to kind of always keep these feeding back into one another. That, okay, so where am I in the book? Where am I in the chapter? Where am I in the sentence? Where does the sentence make sense in terms of the book? Where does it make sense in terms of the chapter? That this is a helpful way for me to kind of orient myself within a text. If you can get to the end of a chapter and be able to basically say, okay, this chapter was about X, that can be a win. Hopefully, as you continue on, you begin to develop more sort of nuanced takes, but sometimes what we're fighting against is just to close a book and then say, what did I just read? So if you can sort of basically take away a couple of main things from each chapter, that's good. Which leads into my next point, which is don't try to understand everything. You're not going to understand everything. That understanding philosophical text takes years and years of reading from different scholars, different traditions, different time periods to understand how everything sort of connects together. So get what you can. If you read a paragraph and you say, I have no idea what that paragraph just said, and you reread it and you still have no idea with what it just said, that's okay. Move on. You can underline it and put a question mark. Sometimes what I do is I'll underline it and I'll try to paraphrase it in my own words. Because sometimes that unlocks something, right? If you say it yourself, it's like, oh, I think that's what they're saying. So that's kind of another strategy of but you move on, and then sometimes it'll click later. You don't this isn't an excuse to skim, but basically to say, there's not an expectation that you will come away from this book understanding precisely everything that is said. And then there's two other sort of questions of what's the author trying to say. That's one thing. And then what can be implied or extended from what the author does say. That there's a sort of reflexive back and forth here of an author might be trying to say something, and then the point that they make might work for or against sort of their larger argument, that there might be implications that the author seems to have missed, that there's a difference between what's actually in the text and what can be gleaned from the text that the author may or may not intend to be included. Yeah, so email me with questions if you have them. The other thing that I want to do is just give a quick disclaimer on Lingus and his sort of style of writing. So and I'll include it with a disclaimer about this book and my experience with it, which is that so Lingus is a famous sort of translator of Emmanuel Levinas, who we'll be reading later this semester. And I've read a bit of his work where he's talking about Levinas, but I haven't read any of his philosophy where he's trying to argue something until reading this book this semester with you guys. So this is my first time reading this book as well. And I just want to basically put a disclaimer out there that it can get pretty intense. That he has this sort of style where we'll talk about it later a little bit, that can get a bit sexual, or it can at certain points it seems like it may be misogynistic or homophobic. There's really only one point where you get to that, so don't feel like you have to open it up and be concerned about the whole text seeming like that. It's basically it's one page, and we'll talk about this. It's in the Faces, Idols, and Fetishes chapter. We'll talk about this because part of what he's trying to do is challenge what's a stereotype versus what's a particular. So I want to give that disclaimer, basically to say, he is doing something with this text that is meant to challenge the reader. And I think it's good to read things from a variety of perspectives, even perspectives that challenge your own. But that said, I understand that everybody comes from a different background. Everybody has basically a different limit with what they can or can't tolerate. And if you get to a page where you basically say, this is troubling to me, this is too much, then just turn the page. And if it's still too much, turn to the next page. That don't feel like you have to read anything that that sort of is viscerally offensive to you. I don't think that will be the case with this book, but I want to just put it out there, just because I understand that he can get a little bit intense. And beyond that, if there is anything in this book that's very concerning to you, then send me an email, and we can talk about sort of how to think through that, how to deal with that, how to engage with important literature that maybe challenges your own lived experience in a way. Sometimes challenges can be good, but sometimes they can feel aggressive or like they're tearing you down. And so some professors assign things basically as endorsements, and that's not what I do. I assign things from a variety of perspectives and approaches. And again, I think Lingus is trying to do something rhetorically here, and part of it is he's speaking to the stereotypes of his time in the 90s, and if it were written today, it would be he would be challenging different stereotypes. So anyway, I'll move on from that. I don't think it should be that bad. I think this is probably a big preamble, and you'll get there and you'll say that's what he was talking about, and you'll be fine. But I did just want to kind of put that out there, that I'm always here to talk if need be. All right, so now let's get into the actual text. I'll try to keep this brief because my preamble's been pretty long this week. All right, so chapter 1 is called The Other Community. This is one of the shorter chapters. Basically, what he's dealing with here is the idea of a rational community versus what he calls the other community. And the rational community is basically this community that shares in a way of thinking. That rationality is a way of basically saying we all have these sort of same structures of consciousness, that logic appears the same for everybody. And so reason is something universal that can tie us together. So this relates to communication, right? Communication, the community of those who have nothing in common. How do we communicate with people that we don't have anything in common with? Well, Lingus is saying that part of the assumption of communication is that everybody has rationality in common. But then he starts to think about, well, what about when we communicate to others without using reason? And so he talks about traditions where you basically say, why do you do that? And you say, because our parents did it this way, or because the gods told us to do it this way, which is a very different explanation than why do you do that? And you say, because it works better than the alternative way, or because we're trying to get this end result. That one of those is a rational explanation, and one of those is not. And his point here is not to make a hierarchy between those two, but to say that reason is a way that we actually eliminate differences. And he's interested in exploring this idea of communication between people where difference is maintained, where you're able to basically say, no, 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 it's not that I'm saying that this is the best way to do something. It's not that I'm saying that everyone thinks this way. It's that I'm saying this is our tradition. How do you engage with someone that says this is our tradition, and it's not a move to bring you into that tradition uh, or to persuade you of that practice? What does that kind of communication mean? What does that look like? Another thing to look out for is he has this idea of the imperative. The imperative comes up in several different ways, but a big part of it is the imperative is this sort of universal impulse toward understanding in human existence, right? That you can't not interpret. You can't not try to understand things. That this is sort of a condition of human existence that we are always trying to situate things within our own understanding. And our own sort of thought. So the other community, that's chapter 1, pretty cool stuff. I won't talk about it too much more. Like I said, I'm trying to be brief. So the second one is the intruder. This is where he really starts to talk about basically others. And he does this in a sort of interesting way of beginning with the body. So what's the relation to the body and sort of reason? How do I relate to my external world? Is my external world something that I act upon, or does it act upon me? Does it inform what I think, or does what I think inform the world? That he's playing through this sort of tension of these two things in order to eventually basically get to this idea of the other. And he introduces here the idea of the other, which is similar to this other community that talks about in the first chapter. But the difference between the other as an other and an other as a variation of the same. So the other is a variation of the same. That's sort of this idea of the other under like a universal logic or something that you share together. That we can even take it to basically like Duquesne students, that the other is a variation of the same. Is you might be in the liberal arts school and your friend might be in the nursing school, but you're all Duquesne students. You're all variations of the same, as opposed to the other as the other, who is the Pitt student. Or you can even get more drastic, right? Because you're variations of the same college students, of the high school student, or you're still students. Now we can think about the other as basically you can imagine these alterities that are getting more and more radical, that less and less is in common. The other is basically, how do I engage with someone's otherness without trying to find that common ground, that trying to appreciate them through what is different rather than through what's the same. Then there's this other idea of the depth perception of the other, and this will be important, especially in terms of the next chapter, where, like I said, it can seem like he's being sort of stereotypical at times. So this depth perception of the other, and again, we actually see here this idea of performances that's come up a couple times with the face theory, and with the data profiles and identity piece from last week. So basically what Lingus says here is that when we engage with others, several things appear to us at once. That on the one hand, they appear as basically types. That I appear to you as a type of man, that I appear to you as a type of professor, that I appear to you as a type of my race. But I also appear to you sort of biologically, right? So as having certain like physiological reactions and whatnot. But I also appear to you as a gender, or I do appear to you as a gender, as a particular. That I am different than any of the other professors that you interact with. That I am different than any of the other men that you interact with. That there is something about me that has to be different in order for me to be basically intelligible. And so Lingus is talking about the depth perception as this sort of attentiveness to all of these levels. That on the one hand, we play into the expectations that others have of us. That I'm talking to you about these ideas as a professor, and he uses the example of the professor. that I'm playing into what I think you think a professor should act like. But I'm also breaking these, that I'm trying to establish my particularity within these norms. And so the depth perception of the other is basically this attentiveness to how identity is being performed. That's taking in text from other sources into Lingus's work, but basically saying, now I see him behaving this way. Is that behavior, is he leaning into a stereotype there and trying to appeal to expectations, or is he trying to break a stereotype? Or is this or not even that he's trying to break a stereotype? Is this not representative of a stereotype? This is him and his particularity. That there are these sort of tensions of sort of back and forth in the way that we perceive others and ourselves. And stereotype here doesn't necessarily mean in a negative sense. I think actually primarily it's basically not meant in a negative sense. So here's the faces, idols, and fetishes chapter. Big thing here is this idea of value terms, things that don't communicate information. Something like I love you. The one where I think he's probably just talks about it in a way that I wouldn't talk about it is telling somebody that they're beautiful. Things that are not meant for me to say, I have basically an idea in here and I'm trying to transfer into your mind. That the response to it is something that's more affective, that it's something that's more almost like the way that you engage in the environment. So this idea that not all language is basically information transfer, that we don't just use language to move things from my mind to yours, that there's basically ways of engaging in the world, engaging with language with others, that's beyond that framework. Part of this is what's the role of the sensory in communication, right? How do I communicate what I feel? Not like emotionally. I mean, that's part of it. But how is it possible for me to communicate what pain is, what pleasure is? How can I display those things that are by definition not symbolic? And this leads into basically the question of, can the sensory be communicated? This idea of idols and fetishes are, well, and even faces, are kind of ways that Lingus is engaging with this question of how can the sensory be communicated. That an idol is basically an attempt at communicating the sensory that holds up one experience above all the rest, and a fetish is one that holds up an experience against all the rest. It's a weird chapter, I'm not going to lie to you, but you know, there's some important stuff in there, and yeah, do what you will with it. All right, so chapter 4, this is the good one, this is the big one. The Murmur of the World. This is where he really starts to get into communication and sort of his philosophy of communication. And so he's using these terms from the school of thought called information theory. What's the relation of a message to noise in communication? And noise is this idea of basically what gets included in communication that's not the message. So like the classic example would be like the static on the TV, or like when cell phones are pretty good now, but when you pick up the phone and you hear kind of like the fuzz in the background, that's the noise. Other examples of the noise, like Lingus talks about this, would be like a misprint in a book. Somebody's handwriting that includes an extra tail on a letter, or the eraser marks. These are all examples of noise. So what's the relation of the message to the noise? The sort of classic idea is that the message needs to get selected out of the noise. That your understanding of a message is dependent on you being able to say, that eraser mark is not intended for me to be interpreted along this message. That misprint is not meant for me to be taken literally. That you're able to decide what is it that I perceive that is supposed to be interpreted and what's supposed to be ignored. So Lingus kind of extends this into talking about, again, this idea of the ideas, the universal that he talks about in the first chapter. And he says, so when we think about a word, this is classic sort of semiotics, the study of signs, that we think about a word as a signifier. Okay, so something that represents something else. The word itself, the thing that you see or hear, that's the signifier, and it relates to the signified. The signified is what it represents. So I can say the word pen, and when I say that word, you get in your mind, here it is, an image of this thing. Now, traditionally, we think about the signified as ideal, as in your mind, and the signifier as physical, as material. Lingus makes a really interesting move here where he says that the signifier, the word, what you see and hear, that's already ideal too. And his reasoning is not that you only experience, seeing or hearing a word in your mind as if you're just trapped in here and you're imagining everything out there. But for you to understand that word as a word, you already have to assume that it's a type. That you can say pen, or you can write pen in any number of material settings. That you can write it in cursive, in print, that you can use Times New Roman or Comic Sans, but that type already exists before, that type as an idea, right? Those letters, P-E-N, before any material encounter with it. That the word, the signifier, is already ideal before even the idea of the pen is ideal. It's a really cool move, and I think really smart. So that's kind of important. It talks about communication with the other as vulnerability. That whenever you engage with others, you find yourself open and exposed to them. That your decision to go out and say something means that you are now open to being critiqued, to being to having an alternative view, to being challenged. In a weird sense, this is maybe why I gave such a long preamble about this book, because me assigning this book is a kind of communication with you, even though I didn't write it. That my assigning this book then made me vulnerable to having to say things about a text that said some things that I was uncomfortable with. That there's a moment of vulnerability in any kind of communication, where you become open to the other, or exposed to the other, to use some of Lingus's terms. So I want to talk about back to this noise thing. So he says, we are the efficient causes of our sentences, and our particularity is the noise. Efficient cause comes from Aristotle. He has this idea of four causes that we won't go over now. Google it if you're interested. It's cool. But the efficient cause is basically the creator, the craftsman, the person who makes something. That I'm making the sentences I'm speaking right now. And Lingus makes this point that yes, we're the maker of our sentences. The things that we're trying to say, they come from me. But there's also something that's always communicated in our speech, in our writing, that's not what we've said. It's this little circle that's in the bottom of your video right now, that I'm also always being communicated in my particularity, in what I look like, in what I sound like. These things that you're filtering out as you're interpreting what I'm saying, that there's a particularity in what in the way that I'm communicated, that's noise. It's not the message, but it's there. How do you understand that? That there are always parts of my experience that are necessary for the message. My handwriting is always communicated but it's not the message. My particularity is the noise, and Lingus is basically trying to reclaim this idea of the noise, where he's saying like, yes, this is not the message per se, but there's still something that's central here to communication. Of how do you understand that particularity? How does that particularity affect the way that you engage with any kind of given message? So, this chapter is a fantastic example of how to do philosophy of communication, of how to take a philosophical sort of approach to communication. That what is this thing that we do when we communicate? I hope you enjoy this one. I hope you enjoy the rest of the book. Even aside from my disclaimer, I really have liked this text so far. So I hope that it challenges you in a good way and not in a bad way. Like I said, please, if anything troubles you, send me an email. We can work through it together. But I think that it really should be a pretty good and fun read. So I look forward to hearing what you all think, and we will see you next time.